I had to change my title over there for Twitch. They thought they don't like the word damning. All right. So we are getting ready. We're waiting for this to start. And this is the Denver City Council Committee on Murdering the Unhoused and Black People, as I like to call it. They think of it as the Committee on Safety, Houselessness, and some shit. But yeah, so if you read yesterday, the Office of the Independent Monitor came out with a report about DPD activity over the summer, which they said there were some problems, and now they're going to present the formal report.
As chair of this committee, before we get into today's agenda, I will ask my colleagues to introduce themselves in district number order. Looks like we're starting with Northwest Denver.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Amanda Sandoval, Northwest Denver, District 1.
Good morning, Kevin Flynn, Southwest Denver, District 2.
And Jamie Torres, District 3.
Andy Sadavaca, District 9.
We love you.
Good morning. Oh, sorry, you guys skipped me. Amanda Sawyer, District 5.
Good morning, Stacy Gilmore, District 11.
Fuck you.
Good morning, Robin Kinich, at large.
Fuck you.
Well, good morning, everybody. I think we got everyone in. Checking the screen. So as we're all too familiar at this point, earlier this summer, in the days following the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, massive demonstrations erupted across the country, including here in Denver. And in the days following those demonstrations here in the Mile High City, this council became concerned, along with many other folks, at reports coming in about excessive use of force from members of the Denver Police Department. And in a unanimous vote, this council asked our independent monitor, Nick Mitchell, and his team to look into those allegations and report on their assessment of the performance of our safety department during those demonstrations. So that being said, we'll turn the floor over to Nick Mitchell, who will present his report.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay.
You're good, sir.
All right, thank you. Well, thanks for giving me an opportunity to come in and talk with you about this report, what we found. With me is Matt Butis, who's sharing a screen with you. So we've got a slide deck up. I was originally asked to do this in about 20 minutes. I don't think I can do it that quickly, but I'm going to aim for 30, so to leave enough time for question and comment and discussion with all of you after I run through this presentation.
Thank you.
So first thing I guess I want to say is I want to recognize that we, in doing this work, in responding to your request, there was a lot of transparency and collaboration from the police department, and I want to sort of recognize Chief Hazen, Director Robinson, their teams, as well as the many officers who we spoke with during our review, who were willing to share information with us, willing to share their perspectives with us, and that was very gratifying.
So they're starting by thanking the DPD for their transparency. That doesn't bode well.
Community members who were extremely open with us about their experiences, and I also want to thank my own team. You all asked that we do this work promptly and thoroughly. I conveyed that request to my staff. They responded, incredibly well, with a lot of enthusiasm and energy, and so I'm just really thankful for their hard work and their talent. I'm going to again give a sort of high-level overview of the report to leave enough time for questions.
Kevin Gate,
advance the slides, please. Some just sort of basic facts, and we touch on this in greater detail in the report. The protest began in Denver on the 28th of May, 2020. Again, as Councilman Cashman mentioned, after the murder of George Floyd, they really began to erupt throughout the protests began to erupt throughout the United States, around the 26th of May. And it wasn't until the 28th that we began to see significant protest activity downtown in our city. The protests were characterized by large crowds, sometimes extremely large crowds, mostly peacefully demonstrating during the day. But as night fell during each of the first 5 days, there tended to be a change in tenor and a change in the kinds of activity on the streets.
Y'all shot at us and we got pissed.
Of Denver by small groups
Really?
or individuals. There were a number of things about these protests that were unique or different than lots of the other demonstrations that Denver has experienced in its recent history. Protests have historically been, at least in my experience, and I'm going to generalize a little bit here, so there may be exceptions to this rule, but demonstrations in Denver have historically been sort of directional. They've moved from point A to point B, and then there have been, speeches and activities at a particular.
Because this has been a really white town
these
that hasn't
demonstrations
dealt
were very
with
different in that they
police brutality,
they
which has
moved
been
throughout
increasing.
the downtown. There were lots of groups moving in different parts of the downtown. There was no kind of clear point A and point B, and I raise that because it kind of gives context and color, I think, for some of the challenges that the police department.
Are you saying
experienced
the
in
protests weren't well
responding, to these
organized?
demonstrations. They also, of course, were incredibly large. By the third day, it was estimated that more than 10,000 people were filling the streets of our downtown. That number may not be accurate, but the number was extremely large. All of us saw it with our own two eyes. So that was another sort of factor in what made these demonstrations unique. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, there was some violence in the streets of Denver. There were also quite a number of arrests. Most of them were for curfew, so there were 339 arrests during the first 5 days. I suppose I should say that we focused our analysis on the first 5 protest days. The protests, of course, lasted into mid-June, but given that most of the highest points of conflict or the highest moments of conflict between the police department and protesters occurred during the first 5 days, we decided to focus our attention and our review on those days. In terms of activity in the streets, we looked at a number of different metrics. There were more than 200 fire-related calls on the streets of Denver. 33 guns were seized from the streets. And there were also significant, numerous injuries, serious injuries to protesters and police. There were 81 officer injuries reported by the police department. 11 officers were placed on limited duty. 4 had to take time off of work given their injuries. I know that the chief has indicated that some of those officers have not returned to duty or have had modified duty since that time. Next slide, please. There were also many serious community member injuries. We looked at a variety of metrics to try to measure that number. None was particularly authoritative. There were 125 calls for paramedic assistance and responses from the paramedic division downtown in
no tracking a number of injuries to protesters.
To the protests and
Nope.
injuries sustained by protesters during the George Floyd demonstrations. Again, many of the community injuries went unreported, so we don't think that 125 represents the sum total of the injuries sustained by community members during the demonstrations. There were many complaints filed with my office. I know with some of your offices, over 100 complaints concerning specific acts of misconduct were filed and opened as investigations by the Internal Affairs Bureau. More than 50 of those investigations remain open with oversight by my office There was significant damage to government property and private businesses.
Just a suggestion, if you're spraying gas into a crowd of 5,000, then maybe it's safe to say the range of the gas was X amount of feet.
Or there is a sort of
therefore, at least a quarter received injuries.
With these events, 3 lawsuits.
You sprayed gas.
By our count, and more than 50 additional notices of claim have been served upon the city. So I think it's fair to characterize that a wave of litigation is coming. Next slide, please. To do the work that you asked us to do, and I won't delve deep here, but we reviewed policies, procedures, reports of various kinds from the police department, rosters to the extent they were available, inventories to the extent they were available, officer statements, et cetera, hundreds of hours of body-worn camera, halo, and helicopter footage, all of the police radio communications from the first 5 days. We also interviewed, as I suggested earlier, we interviewed dozens of officers and command staff, many community members, and reviewed other relevant kind of research and literature about best practices and national standards. Next slide, please. In terms of the munitions used, and again, we walked through this in great detail in the report, there were a number of kind of primary munitions and systems, weapon systems used by the police department in responding to the protest. Pepper ball launchers, as people are aware from their own observations and from the video footage and from other things they may have heard or seen, 40mm launchers, OC foggers, gas and smoke grenades, rubber ball grenades, and flashbangs. And again, we provide kind of specific details about the manufacturer guidelines for the use of each of these tools in our report and other discussion about each one of them. Next slide. I guess one of our primary findings, and I think perhaps the most important kind of group of findings from the report, relates to the police department's use of internal controls to manage its response and to manage officer use of force during the protests. And we have quite a bit of discussion about that in the report. And the internal controls really are tools that police management can use to try to sort of regulate the way that force is used during inherently chaotic events. Crowd control events are chaotic, even on the best day. They can be extremely chaotic and very difficult to manage. Individual supervisors, so police supervisors are generally deployed in the field with a certain number of officers under their command.
This is way worse than I thought.
Are generally spread.
This is police apology.
Sort of closely oversee
this is propaganda.
The way that each one of those officers is using force in the field, and so this variety of systems has been developed to help departments keep better track of the way that force is being used. On that list are tracking systems for less lethal munitions, the creation of officer rosters to track who is assigned and where, requiring body camera activation to record uses of force, prompt preparation of use of force reports to document when force has been used and why, issuing and recording orders for crowd dispersal, and only permitting officers who've received the requisite specialized training to deploy certain high-risk, less lethal tools. And we found significant deficiencies in each one of those systems as it was used by the police department or not used during the protest. Next slide. First off, as we discussed in the report, the department did not effectively or completely track its less lethal munitions. So as we discussed, the DPD acquired over $200,000 worth of less lethal munitions during the first 5 days. Ideally, we would have looked at tracking logs to ascertain where and to whom those munitions were distributed and how they were deployed in the field, but there were no tracking logs. There was no system in place to effectively track where those munitions were being deployed, how quickly each individual team of officers was running through them. And so we, instead we looked, because we did not have that, or because the department didn't have that kind of tracking system in place, we looked instead to acquisitions. We obtained all of the receipts and purchase orders connected to the acquisition of those munitions, because it was reasonably easy for us to determine the kind of quantity and volume that were acquired, but again, impossible to determine the quantity deployed during the protests. There's a few graphics here that we pulled from the report that sort of show the volume of each munition the department had in its existing inventory when the protests began, and the amount ordered during the protests. Next slide. Another important internal control, as I mentioned, is body cameras and appropriate use of body cameras. We requested, in connection with this analysis, access to evidence.com, which we do not currently have. Instead, the DPD sent us links. The DPD did its own searching inside that database, and sent us links to all of the video that the DPD had determined was tied to these events. So they sent us links to over 1,200 individual video files, which was 226 hours of body-worn camera video. And in reviewing it, and we reviewed it all many times, we not only reviewed it for the purpose of understanding the ways that force was being used by officers, we also reviewed it to determine the rate at which officers were complying with requirements to activate their body cameras, and there were big gaps there. I won't sort of belabor the way that we arrived at our calculations, but I guess I will say that for the one day during those first 5 that the police department had prepared a roster, there were 150 to 200 officers working that day, but only footage for 38 officers. And we go through in the report a variety of reasons for that gap, or things that we think are reasons for the gap, or possible reasons. Part of it is the fact that command level officers and detectives were not required to wear body-worn cameras. Some of them were in the command post and were not interacting with the public. That's only a fraction of the gap. And so we think there were other issues there in addition to just that decision about not giving cameras to those command level officers that were responsible for the footage gap that we discussed in the report. Next slide. Another important internal control is the prompt preparation of use of force statements. As a city, we need to have a record when a police officer uses force against a community member. We need to know about it. We need to be able to look at video if it's available. We need to be able to look at a written record that documents why force was used, gives us the ability to make decisions about whether or not the force was compliant with policy. And so it's fairly, or I would say it's almost universal for law enforcement agencies to require the preparation of written use of force reports to document use of force. During the first 5 days of the protests, no written use of force reports were required. Officers were not required to prepare them. It was only after a particular lawsuit was filed seeking a temporary restraining order, I believe on the 5th of June, that the department went back and began to require officers to try to reconstruct uses of force that they had been engaged in many days prior, and prepare use of force statements to document those incidents. But as we discuss in the report, the statements that were ultimately produced, and we received over 400 use of force statements, were deficient in a variety of ways. First, they were vague, and I'm generalizing because some of them were reasonably detailed, but in general they were relatively vague. They were often repetitive. There were some officers who had the same boilerplate sort of texts they repeated day after day, which really revealed nothing about the particular uses of force that they had been involved in. And they were generally unhelpful in assessing the force that was used. Some officers, even in their use of force statements, expressed concern that they were being asked to document uses of force that had happened a week or more ago, and they even felt uncomfortable being in that position. Another deficient internal control was the inconsistent recording of crowd dispersal orders. So it's a best practice in law enforcement that when force is going to be used to disperse a crowd, that the crowd be warned in advance.
This is important.
A verbal warning given over a loudspeaker that remaining in a particular area may subject persons to force or arrest. Those warnings should be recorded if possible, and they should be documented in a writing as well. DPD policy is largely consistent with those best practices, but the DPD did not do a particularly good job during the first 5 days of recording those dispersal orders, or in some cases of issuing them. Next slide. Right, so I suppose that leads in here that through our review of hundreds of hours of video, we identified many situations in which crowds were dispersed, usually with chemical munitions like gas grenades, sometimes with pepper ball, and it was only in a minority of those situations that we heard dispersal orders being issued. And sometimes when we heard dispersal orders, they complied with policy. They included all the information that is required. Other times they didn't. They often did not provide the crowd with a route, with kind of an exit path or guidance about how to exit from the area. If we heard a dispersal order, it may be that we would only hear one, not kind of a countdown, which again, the best practices suggest that a crowd should be given sort of multiple warnings unless there's an emergency that prevents that from happening. And we just didn't hear the kinds of dispersal orders being given routinely that we expected that we might. Another important internal control relates to the ability of the public to identify officers who they have interacted with. It's a best practice in law enforcement, and the DPD has policies concerning officer identification, having badge numbers available on the exterior of an officer's uniform, so that if a member of the public has a negative interaction or a positive one, they know who they've interacted with, and they can report that through the appropriate channels. Here, we identified through our video review there were problems with officer identification, with officers not having that information clearly visible on the exterior of their protective equipment, and we're seeing the sort of fruits of that in the internal affairs cases that have been filed. We've had to close a number of investigations, or internal affairs has had to close a number of investigations, and we walk through this in the report, because the complainant was unable to obtain the officer's badge number, and frankly, the investigation didn't reveal it either. Without rosters, without body cam video, it has been extremely difficult in many of these situations to identify who is responsible for a particular deployment of less lethal or a particular use of force. Another internal control that we identified problems with relates to the certification of officers on particular less lethal weapons. Officers should be trained on the certain less lethal tools that are pose potentially serious risks. We focused in the report on the pepper ball launcher and the 40 millimeter launcher. Both can pose serious risks to the health and safety of potential targets. The DPD has a certification process that is, I think it's 4 hours long, and then qualification at the range. And officers who go through that process become, authorized to use those tools in the future. But in reviewing the use of force statements that I've already discussed, there were 5 officers who stated explicitly in those use of force statements that though they had not been certified on those launchers, they were sort of handed to them when they arrived at the protest, and they were given some kind of emergency, field training on the scene. Other officers reported having used those weapons, but they did not appear on the list of officers who had been certified. So they did not explicitly say that they were sort of field trained, if you will, but it was our suspicion that might have been the case for those officers as well. So it was another sort of internal control that was deficient in important ways during the protest. Next slide. During our review of video, we certainly saw incidents involving people targeting police officers, throwing rocks or other weapons at police officers, and it's our understanding that some people have been charged criminally in connection with that behavior, and those cases are still pending. We also saw examples of police officers using force in ways that we found to be troubling, and that we have referred to the police department for internal investigation. We saw police officers directing pepper balls at persons who were verbally objecting and not engaged in any apparent physical resistance. We saw pepper ball being deployed.
So they referred to IA. We can't refer anywhere else. It has to go through IA first. That's because we got to change the city charter.
Primarily at people after they were already leaving an area. We saw explosive devices being thrown extremely close to people, sometimes resulting in them being knocked to the ground and suffering apparent injury. We also saw, puzzlingly, pepper spray being deployed at drivers into vehicles, or chemical or munitions, throwable munitions being thrown into lanes of traffic in ways that caused us significant concern about the inability or potential danger that could be created by drivers whose vision was compromised by pepper spray or other chemical munitions. Next slide. The report also discusses the policies of the department, the use of force policies and crowd management policies, and provides some recommendations and some analysis about gaps in existing policy that we believe the department needs to fill. First, the department really provides no meaningful guidance in its policies about the use of high-risk explosive devices. And when I say that, I'm referring to rubber ball grenades and flashbangs. I won't sort of go into in great detail the technical kind of details concerning those two tools. Rubber ball grenades, I'll just say, are pretty dangerous. They contain generally, several hundred or close to it rubber balls that, when the grenade is detonated, those rubber balls are propelled outwards in 360 degrees. They can travel for almost 50 feet. Importantly, rubber ball grenades cannot be targeted, so they cannot be directed at a specific individual. So even if, someone is about to throw a weapon at a police officer or target a police officer, even if even if it would be appropriate to intercept that or prevent that by targeting that individual with a less lethal weapon,
guys,
rubber ball grenades are inappropriate for that purpose. You throw it, it's thrown next to one person and it hits everyone else in the vicinity. Research has also shown that the body of the grenade can itself become shrapnel, and research that we've reviewed raises concerns about eye injuries, other soft tissue injuries, and even potential lethality from rubber ball grenades. Flashbangs you may be more familiar with, and so I won't go into the particulars of flashbangs here in this meeting, but the policy was deficient in terms of setting forth a threshold for the use of both of those devices. And it's my understanding that, by the way, the department agrees and has committed to filling that gap following the release of this report. Next slide. We discussed in the report the standard for the use of pepper ball. Pepper ball was used, as you can see from the inventory documents, the DPD acquired and consumed or expended a high volume of pepper ball during the protests. You may have seen that in footage on the news, or you may have seen it with your own eyes if you were down there. Pepper ball has two primary uses. So it can be used to saturate an area with the chemical powder inside the pepper ball round. That's called area saturation. It's fired at the feet of individuals, or it's fired into hard objects near where they're standing, like a wall. And when it's used in that way, again, the pava powder inside the round kind of explodes, the pava powder is emitted, and it causes a sort of a chemical reaction it's very uncomfortable to be around, and so people will leave that immediate area. It can also be direct fired. That means it can be fired into a person's body, which both exposes them to the chemical pepper powder, and it also causes the pain of impact. And it can cause damage, even lasting damage. The standard in DPD policy for pepper ball does not distinguish between the area saturation and the direct fire methods of use. The same standard applies in a crowd control situation. It's defensive resistance, which we include that definition in the report for your reference. And that, from our perspective, that's inappropriate. The standard should be different for targeting a person's body with an impact projectile than it should be for exposing them to the pepper powder for the area saturation method of use. We've recommended that the DPD both articulate the difference between those two applications more clearly in its policies and create different standards, create a higher threshold for direct fire applications in its policies. The DPD has agreed. Next slide. Another important series of findings in the report relates to the mutual aid provided by other law enforcement agencies in Denver. This is something that you all specifically asked us to look into. We did. 18 law enforcement agencies or multi-jurisdictional teams responded to Denver in response to requests for assistance made by the Denver Police Department. They were mostly tactical teams, so kind of SWAT or SWAT-like teams who came to Denver with all of the requisite tactical gear, and among our sort of we don't necessarily question that the department needed to request aid from other jurisdictions. Mutual aid is well established in kind of thinking about best practices in law enforcement. Mutual aid is a common feature of many kind of jurisdictions that neighbor one another, but national standards call for comprehensive mutual aid agreements to be negotiated in advance of any mutual aid deployment. So there should be agreements in place that establish the ground rules for a mutual aid deployment, who can request aid, under what circumstances, what type of aid will be provided. The agreement should lay out a command structure for command and control when other agencies have responded to another jurisdiction to provide assistance. And the DPD did not have any relevant mutual aid agreements with those 18 law enforcement partners. So we asked the DPD for copies of any of its mutual aid agreements. 8 were provided, but 6 of those were with agencies that were not present in Denver during the protests, and 2 were with agencies that were present, but they simply weren't relevant to the enforcement that happened during these events. They related to other matters. They did not cover crowd control mutual aid. So the gap, the lack of agreements, setting forth all of these issues was a significant problem from our perspective. Next slide. We also attempted to assess the kind of aid that each agency provided in Denver. we had access to some records from some of the agencies, but certainly not a comprehensive universe of documents from those agencies. Not due to any fault of theirs or lack of transparency on their part. We simply didn't have, from our perspective, the time or the resources to do significant document requests of 18 different agencies. We did obtain after action reports from a number of the agencies, as well as some use of force policies that provided the standards under which they used force in Denver. From our review, we can say that some of the agencies were extremely active on our streets here in Denver. And by that, I mean they conducted some of their own arrests. They used force of various kinds and with various less lethal tools. Other agencies were a bit more passive. That's my kind of language, not theirs. But they were involved in sort of protecting particular government buildings, protecting property, escorting firefighters, doing sort of force protection for firefighters, responding to fire calls, preventing people from entering the interstate, but not as heavily involved in conflict or use of force as some of the other agencies.
Guys, I'm cringing. This is terrible.
I think we can say that
terrible.
Some of the agencies used less lethal weapons that are not approved under DPD policies. So
right.
From our review of their documents, we determined that they use rubber ball rounds, less lethal shotguns, beanbag rounds. These are all tools that have been disapproved for use by DPD officers. But during the protests here in Denver, they were used by other agencies policing our streets. Another important gap that we saw was that the standard for use of force in the various use of force policies that we reviewed varied. So the DPD has articulated one standard that is reasonably stringent as use of force policies go, but not every agency adhered to that same stringent standard or articulated that same stringent standard in their use of force policies. Which may have translated into different approaches to when force.
I'm just curling up in a ball over here. This report is just horrifying.
The protests, and not all of the agencies required intervention to prevent inappropriate force. Of course, that was a feature of the state law recently passed. So I assume it is now a part of everyone's use of force policy. But at that time,
is it really? Is that a safe assumption, you guys?
It was a feature of the DPD's policy, but not some of its partner agencies who are invited onto our streets. And so we've recommended that the DPD, in its negotiations with other agencies, as it works to develop mutual aid agreements, come up with a framework that would harmonize some of these differences if we ever need to request mutual aid again in our city. Next slide. And so, finally, as we did this investigation, as I've talked about, we made a series of recommendations to the department, 16 recommendations. My understanding is that the department has largely accepted all of them and committed to implementing all of them. We also encountered issues that were sort of operational in nature, that rather than making a specific
I can barely listen to this, and I'm glad my kids aren't around right now because I am going to need. You saw my previous thread about self-care. I'm going to need to
the fact that many of
swim
the
in magnesium for about an hour after this.
And some of the mid-level supervisors said they weren't always sure what they should be doing on the streets, that they didn't always have clear guidance about strategic objectives, which
didn't know the objectives.
Which buildings to
these are former military people. A lot of people leave the military and go into the police force,
when to
especially in Denver,
and leave protesters
acting without directives.
To hold a
not smiled on y'all.
And we saw this sort of echoed in our video review of body camera video. We saw incidents in which a particular intersection, the police officers would advance upon it, and clear a crowd from an intersection and hold it for a particular period of time and then back away again. And then an hour later, they would kind of come back and there would be another round of conflict at that same location. And so, we felt like that was, I guess, reinforcing some of what we were hearing from the folks on the ground about not always having a clear a strategic sense of what they should be doing when they were out there policing these protests. We talk about the radio channel. So all communication with the command post, all police radio communication was concentrated on a single radio channel during these events. And we heard what felt like countless complaints from officers about the inability to get access to the air when they needed it. So, supervisors in particular have a need for communicating back and forth with the command post. It may be a request for additional resources, additional officers. It may be a request for guidance about, when to use chemical munitions to clear a particular location. There are a whole host of reasons why mid-level supervisors would need to communicate with the command post. And we heard, that quite often in the middle of, intense conflict, officers would key up their radios, or usually sergeants would key up their radios and attempt to get on the air. But because there was a single radio channel for all police communications, they'd be unable to get access. Someone else would already be on the air. And so they were unable to communicate with the command posts. They often turned to using their individual cell phones, but they were generally wearing gas masks.
But her
were unable
emails
to use cell phones in many circumstances as well. So the communication between the field and the command post was was obstructed by the fact that only a single radio channel was being used. I frankly am not. Don't have any background in police radio operations. I'm not sure what the fix is for that problem. So I wanted to refer it to the police department. It certainly needs to be fixed. But what the appropriate fix is, I'm simply not sure. Another issue that we heard repeatedly from officers was that there had been a decrease in the volume and the frequency of crowd control and field force operations training over in recent years. That before the DNC in particular, there had been a significant focus on preparing officers for potentially chaotic crowd control events. There had been a real focus on training.
I'm thinking what we need to do is take away the turtle gear until they've thought through what to do when they're wearing it.
There continues to be,
I don't know, you guys.
By the police department, refresher training. But we examined records from the training academy, and we did see that there has been a decrease in the frequency of that training and the amount of time that's being devoted to it. The officers we talked to believe that should change. They want more of that training, and frankly, we agree. It is an important part of the preparation for this kind of event, and so we referred that issue back to the police department. What the exact amount of training is or should be, we're not sure, but it certainly needs to be increased from where it has been in. For what's been provided in recent years. So I guess I'll stop there, and I'm available, of course, for questions, comments, thoughts, or observations. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Monitor. I just say very briefly that I think you did an outstanding job, you and your team, at fulfilling council's request for a report on those demonstrations. We're going to go into 15 minutes of public comment. First up, Jesse Paris, you'll have 2 minutes, and we'll keep the time. Go ahead, Jesse.
Members of council, those watching after home, my name is Jesse LaShawn Paris, and I'm representing for Denver Homeless Out Loud, Black Star Action Movement for Self-Defense, Positive Action Commitment for Social Change, as well as the Unity Party of Colorado and Mile High News. And I will be the next mayor of Denver in 2023. I congratulate Nick Mitchell for his work that he did on this presentation. A lot of my constituents were wondering if there was data and statistics about the treatment that the police gave the protesters over this last summer. I was at several of those protests. I witnessed all kinds of mayhem from DPD. It was just very disheartening to see how peaceful protesters were being treated by DPD. I mean, they were pepper sprayed. They had paintball guns shot at them. They had rubber bullets shot at them. All the things that he had mentioned in the presentation, all of those so-called non-lethal forces were used against peaceful protesters. I was one of those peaceful protesters. I lost count how many times I was pepper sprayed and hit with mace and had rubber bullets shot at me and all of the above. So I'm just one of many people that share this concern that DPD is not understanding why people were even out there protesting in the first place.
Yep.
This was about bringing awareness to the fact that we still have racism and white supremacy in this country. It has not gone anywhere. It is still in full effect. And the police department is in charge of enforcing that policy and that system. So we fought against it. And
the police department is inept,
thank you, Nick, for your
incompetent, untrained, unprepared,
Thank you.
unqualified,
Jesse, next up,
uncertified.
Hi,
I'm
everyone.
horrified.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate the report by the Office of the Independent Monitor, but I would like to make a point that if you are depending on DPD to release the footage to you, you are not independent. You do not have access to that data. You couldn't identify officers because they didn't give you the footage to identify those officers. It's really that simple. So again, I appreciate this report. I would love for council to ask for a more in-depth report further than the last 5 days, or the first 5 days rather, of the protests. I would love to see that. I think that that's something that this council could all agree would help address the lack of trust between the community and the current environment that Mr. Parrish spoke to. Additionally, I would want to say, what are the consequences for failing to follow policy? There's a lot of discussion in that report about, oh, we need policy around this or that, or, less than lethal munitions requests. Okay, we need policy around how we're going to report that, policy around how we're going to write our after actions for less than lethal use of force. What is the consequence for failing to do that policy? Because if it exists on paper and it doesn't exist, as a reprimand, as a performance, I don't know, a salary, right? We see DPD as this monolith that isn't responding to community outcry about not doing what they say that they've agreed to do. And I know that Chief Payson has said that he wants to work with the community, but if you're drafting resolutions or implementing policy and then there are no consequences for not following through, I don't feel that that relationship has any trust. So thank you again for this report. I appreciate your time. I hope council continues to investigate uses of force further.
Thank you. Next up, David Hagan.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for having me. I wanted to speak about the fact that I was one of the protesters that was shot with pepper balls and tear gas and several other things over the first 5 days and beyond. I've requested, Cora requested information and video and have gotten absolutely nothing. I had to complain through 2 or 3 emails before I even got a response back to them telling me, no, we will not be providing you with anything because there are current investigations going on that video is for. Well, that I'm investigating myself because I was assaulted, and yet I've gotten nothing from DPD. I find it, I thank you for the report, but I find it disheartening that the city council goes and cut a check for $16 million for these guys, and we don't even know what's happened to the people that have done damage to the citizens of Denver. And what's the point of a body camera if it's not turned on? And I don't think I want any of those guys to have tasers. God, if any of those guys that shot me with pepper balls had tasers, I'd probably still be in the hospital. I actually can still feel welts on my body from May 28th. That's pretty ridiculous. And then also on top of that, like I said, to have them refuse to provide any information. I don't know. I'm very confused at the thought process of a city council right now. giving away all that money. And at the same time, we're not taking care of the people that are in town, that are needed in town, our unhoused folks. So I'm going to go ahead and stop right now. I think that the city council and the mayor and the chief and the sheriff need to get themselves in order here and figure out what's going on, or we're going to vote all of you out of office. Thank you.
Mayor can't run again. He don't give a shit.
Next up, Blair Sagan. Blair, if you can
Yay!
unmute yourself.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, everyone. I want to echo what Lonnie said about consequences, accountability. If these officers are blinding people, how are we keeping them accountable? What are the consequences of the failure to comply with policy? If there are no consequences, nothing will change. So I also have some numbers I wanted to talk about. So in the first 5 days of the George Floyd protests, $202,341 were spent. Colorado Village Collaborative says that they can build a tiny home for $15,000. So that's about housing about up to 27 people. In what the police spent in the first 5 days. So, we're in the middle of a housing crisis. The police are getting $16 million while people are going without houses to upgrade their already existing cameras, which they don't use. We've seen, 20, 30 something out of 150 to 200 officers that were actually using these cameras. Are there policies that they should be using them? Are the officers that didn't use them getting reprimanded for not using them? I need to see some accountability. This city needs to see some accountability because people are dying. And we are losing trust in Denver city government by the day. So if you don't take action, we're going to vote you out. And if you do take action, I really thank you. And you are actually serving the people. So thank you.
Thank you. Next up, Tess Doherty. Tess, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Go right ahead.
Hi, okay. Thank you for having me speak today, and thank you for the report. I really appreciate, some of the accountability that you did point out in the report, but I'd like to echo what Blair and David and other participants, pointed out, that there is so little accountability in this city government that it really is. I'm just at a loss for what we are doing here and how this is allowed to happen. I'm a public school teacher, and I don't allow my students to go with such egregious lack of accountability. That doesn't happen. So if a kindergartner has to be held more accountable than the city council and the mayor, there is a real problem. That is ridiculous. And, the state of Colorado, we were, 9 years before the Federal Fair Housing Act was passed, we passed anti-discrimination in housing. We used to be applauded for the policy decisions that we made. And in 2020, 50 years later, half a century later, I don't know that people would say the same thing. And when we look back on today, a half century from now, what will we say about the leadership in this city during this time? How will we remember the actions of our elected officials and their response to people experiencing homelessness, to people peacefully protesting? What did they do to ensure the safety and well-being of our community? Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, Adrian Stefanski.
Hello, Council, and thank you, Mr. Mitchell. Your report was actually chilling. I have questions that I have with me, but I guess I'm really taken aback, and I think that for those city council members who are going to continue to not address the police, Could you invest in signage warning people entering our city, the capital of our state, that projectiles may hit them at any moment? Because after hearing that report, I feel like that is what you need. You are the capital city of our state, and people should be able to come here to express their First Amendment right. Mr. Mitchell told you that these were mostly non-violent actions, and I guess what I'm interested in is that in Chief Pazin's response yesterday at the press conference, he used frequently and in tandem riots and protests. He referred to the actions of these 5 days first as riots and second as free speech protests. Now, I don't believe this is true, and I'm wondering if Mr. Mitchell, if you could ask Mr. Mitchell to please provide you the proportion of time out of all of the time the DPD was acting with violence towards citizens. How many of those minutes corresponded with actual acts of violence or things that would be deemed a riot? Also, we heard yesterday that there were 20 cases that have been dismissed, and Chief Pazin did not address whether or not those officers would be asked to self-identify. That is reasonable. Under oath, all officers should be asked to self-identify. That is inappropriate to dismiss those cases because of the wanton disregard for process of the DPD. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final speaker, and I'm not going to risk butchering your name, Romain V.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks for doing this. I'd like to start with a little story, and it's the story of a bridge that collapsed in a community that wasn't mine. And the leader of the land decides to ask the people, should we rebuild this bridge? And the people in my community said no. And the people in the community next to mine said no. And the people in the community next to theirs said no. And all the other communities in this land decided that they wouldn't really pay much attention to the bridge in a community that wasn't theirs. Meanwhile, kids were dying trying to cross the river to get to school. And everyone in that community knew that the bridge was everything to the safety of its people, the health of its people. So the leader of the land decides that the bridge won't be fixed because most of the people, weren't affected by the bridge, didn't really care about the bridge. And so I ask you, what was the leader of the land right in deciding to do nothing? I know most of you ran for public office because you know the communities that need help, and you maybe believe that you could make a difference. Maybe it was your own community, and maybe it was not your own community. What we're seeing right now is that there are plenty of people who may not want to defund the police. And it's largely because they're not the ones facing the injustices. They're not the ones facing the brutalization. It's happening to a community that isn't theirs. I know it's easy to sustain the status quo, and it's really hard to challenge it. But I really hope that this is a moment when we've seen more people show up on the streets than ever before in the history of our country, that this is a time that you think and react and listen to the communities that are so deeply affected by this and say, yes, we will rebuild the bridge.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Romain. Thank you for your comments. Our time is up. I appreciate all of our speakers today. What I would, before we go into comments by members of council, I would urge all my colleagues to read the monitor's report entirely, as well as the letter sent out yesterday by Chief Pazin. This was not simply a situation, oh, well, stuff happens.
Feels like it.
Serious missteps, lack of preparation in.
So what are the consequences, motherfucker?
DPD handled these demonstrations. I recognize the challenges involved in mass gatherings, but this is the agency that we rely on to keep the peace in all situations. So please,
and they're incompetent.
To this material, chilling to say the least. All right, we'll start off first with Councilwoman Sawyer.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chair. Nick, I've got a couple of questions, if you don't mind. And first, I've just got to say thank you. You and your team have done an incredible job and in an incredibly short period of time. So I just want to acknowledge the work that you guys have done. Wow. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You've done a service to our community, and I think I can speak for everyone when I say how grateful we are for the incredible work that you
Great. Now, could you do something?
Here, so thank you.
Do something.
So a couple of questions around the policy piece of this, because we've got the state level 217 law that came out after, this summer. We've got us as council and the potential for things that we could maybe do. And then we've got DPD who sets their policies. Can you talk a little bit about the interplay between those three things and kind of where council might be able to fit and fill some gaps based on what you have found in all of the work that you've done?
I can try. And that may be a subject for an extended discussion. The police department has a variety of internal policies that are created under the authority of the chief of police. The two sort of principal kind of documents that guided the response here were the use of force policy that appears in the police department's operations manual and its crowd management manual, which is not generally a public document. And we comment on aspects of both of those policies in the report, as we've talked about. Those documents are they're mutable. They change with each police administration. Each chief has his or her own individual stamp on the policies of the department. They evolve with changing conditions that the police department faces. And they can really change with the stroke of a pen of whoever happens to be the police chief at a particular time. So, what distinguishes what distinguishes municipal ordinance and state law from those policies is that they're durable. And, ordinance changes and state law changes will outlast any one kind of police administration. So I think, the question that your question would provoke for me is what changes have I discussed
exactly,
or have been revealed by what happened this summer? Do you as a council, do you as a body think need to be durable and need to outlast any particular police administration? I think there could be a lot of different perspectives on that question. There may be different perspectives even on this call, but that to me seems to be the fundamental question that needs to be answered, if you're considering any possible legislation.
Awesome. I really appreciate that. I think you hit the nail on the head, right? I mean, I think that's exactly what you've identified in your report and then in your research at the heart of what we're doing here. And so I really appreciate that because I think that's
just
the
shut
question,
up.
Right?
Just shut up.
Okay, so did you happen to look at what happened in other cities or come across what happened in other cities and find any similarities or glaring differences that you would want to point out here based on our police response versus other city police response or anything like that you could tell us about?
Yeah, we did do some looking, and I would say, Denver was not alone in having some real, challenges and problems in its kind of police management of these events. I think a number of cities around the country had, similar challenges. There really haven't been other analyses like the one that you asked us to put together that have been publicly released so far that I'm aware of. There have been some departments that have on their own issued after action reports to the community that kind of document key facts about the ways that those police departments responded. But it's not the same kind of analysis that we did, so it's a little bit hard to say what the commonalities are. But for sure, Denver was not alone. Many cities had serious challenges, and I expect that some of the issues that we've identified are probably common to other cities in America.
So if everybody's doing it,
That's
it's okay?
Really good to know. Thanks for that. And then I know there's a bunch of other questions in the queue. So last question for you and your office. You identified and reported that there were a number of pieces of information you were not able to get in order to fill out your research and give us the report that we asked for. Some of those were because the information was not there due to gaps in policy and procedure, and some of them were because you were not provided that information by the police department. Is there a way that we can, as council, help you to better receive that information in the future, so that if God forbid this should ever happen again, you can be sure that your office receives full and complete information? And if so, let us know what we can do.
Nothing. Y'all can't get it.
I just want
change the damn city charter.
Again, echo that. My
basically.
experience of this was one of collaboration.
Exactly what she's asking.
And the police department appeared to me to be transparent with its records and with its personnel. So that was a positive experience from that perspective. As I mentioned, evidence.com, we do not have access to. Frankly, I think we should. It's a conversation I've had with prior kind of police administrations. I'm not sure that I've had that discussion with at length with Chief Pazin, but that's an issue that stands out as something that could and should be rectified. But generally, it was our impression.
Tell her, tag her on social media.
Information with us throughout this review.
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilwoman. And I will say I have asked our legislative council to begin looking at opportunities where we might legislatively help move this discussion forward. And I think this might be a topic to bring to policy committee at some point in the near future.
Some point.
Next up.
Not today. We got bigger things going on. Developers.
Madam Pro Tem.
Developers need to rezone.
Thank you so much, Nick. I really appreciate the level of depth that you were able to achieve in such a quick period of time. My first questions are largely around the mutual aid that was provided. When we heard from Chief Pazin in June, when he reported out to this committee, what he told us to my question around how mutual aid was being carried out, he mentioned that one, DPD supervisors would be with every mutual aid team that responded. Did you find that to be accurate? Were you able to get information on who those supervisors were for each team?
Yeah, we did find that to be accurate. We didn't identify there were generally sergeants who were assigned to the mutual aid teams. We didn't identify each sergeant, but we certainly identified a number of sergeants who played that role. And actually, we interviewed a number of sergeants who were assigned because we wanted to know what specifically they were doing when they were attached to those mutual aid teams. And what we learned was that their role, they were not in a position of command authority, so they're not, giving orders or giving direction to those teams. They were, some of them described their role as kind of to provide directions because the teams were getting lost in the chaos of downtown. So they were like a communication resource because they had the Denver police radio and radio system. So they connected each of those teams to the Denver police kind of radio channel. They provided directions to those mutual aid teams. In some cases, a few of those sergeants said that they, would have discussion with the mutual aid teams they were attached to about, use of force issues, but they were not in any kind of command position. And so they were mostly kind of a resource, it seemed to me, for the mutual aid teams. And again, not in a position of command or control.
Were you, or was it important to you to know who or how many from each jurisdiction responded?
I think it was an important fact. We obtained those numbers from the police department, had some kind of rough numbers about, for the number of officers who responded from each jurisdiction. So that was relevant in terms of, assessing the size of the response and giving us perspective as we look through their after action reports. So that was an important piece of information.
I thought it was telling that one of the major discrepancies that you found was that
they've already given them.
Were,
they have money for training.
Told to
they
follow
have.
The policies.
They haven't even figured out how to operate ground comms. Anybody remember there was a whole period in the summer when I was begging for ground comms and satcoms? They haven't worked out how to do communication in their turtle suits. Take fucking turtle suits away.
Curious about. Back in June, I had also asked the chief about the 2017 use of force assessment that you had done. Have you found that the recommendations or observations that you made in that assessment have seen any modification or change since that time?
I think there have been some changes. The department responded to that assessment with some changes that we recommended, and maybe this highlights the point I made in response to Councilwoman Sawyer's point. The use of force policy is changeable, and it's kind of an evolving document. And so, as particular circumstances come up, new things are added or taken away from the use of force policy. I can think of a few examples off the top of my head. In ways of the use of force policy changing in response to particular kinds of issues that have arisen. So yes, it did change in response to the assessment that we released back then. And yes, it has continued to change since that time. And I expect that it will continue to evolve in the future. Certainly, the department has indicated that it's planning to adopt the recommendations in this report. That will require additional changes to the use of force policy, and maybe they'll make other ones as well.
Okay. My last question is about weapons, Nick. So I want to point out that you recommended the outright ban of using rubber ball grenades during crowd control operations. Should they be banned outright, or are there circumstances where they should be allowed?
It's a good question. From my perspective, they're really not an appropriate tool for crowd control. They're, frankly, unconscionable in certain circumstances. But there may be situations in which they are appropriate. I'm not a tactics expert. The department, in discussing our recommendations, raised concerns about the possibility of situations that involve a barricaded suspect who's wanted in connection with a, felony crime, who has a firearm, and who could hurt or kill someone. And in that kind of situation, it may be entirely appropriate to use whatever kind of, explosive distraction device is necessary to resolve that situation without the loss of life, provided that it's appropriately regulated. The department needs policies that set forth
That's
when
right.
it can.
Do you know how to use nunchucks? If I gave you a set, would you know what to do? Imagine just handing them nunchucks on the way. I mean, it's not
make sure
safe.
that it has been used appropriately. So I guess I would not offhand favor completely banning it under all circumstances. But it is clear to me that, at least from my perspective, it is not an appropriate tool for crowd control operations.
And you had stopped short of recommending that pepper ball and 40 millimeter launchers be banned, but that there be only used by certain officers who are authorized or trained. Is that right?
Well, what happens next time they get scared and there's a big crowd?
Okay.
What's going to stop them from doing this
Mr.
again?
Chair. Thank you, Nick.
A policy ain't going to stop them.
Turn over for other questions.
Thank you, Madam Pro Tem.
And it's not going to hold them accountable with the IAB. What is a policy going to change? Defund.
Independent monitor. I do just want to describe my perception of the report. We've heard scathing, we've heard troubling. I will just add one word. I thought the report was fair. I believe that you did your best to describe the conditions as they were experienced by officers, and yet finding the shortfalls that you did. And so I just want to acknowledge that I think that this is, you can be both scathing and fair. And I think that's what this report was. Two questions. The first is about media. We had a lot of independently reported cases of media experiencing use of force, even though they were clearly identified, they were not engaging in activities. I'm curious whether you considered focusing on the question of media treatment, or, or used their footage or interviewed them. And, if you considered it and decided not to, if you just felt like it was outside the scope of the request. But I was just curious about that piece, about those particular individuals who were caught up and targeted in some cases, according to videos that I saw.
Yeah, that is an issue that we considered. I think, from our perspective, some of those incidents remain under investigation, and
by whom?
To kind of make a determination about the incidents and the issue in general, we wanted to see the fruits of those investigations first. So, maybe put a pin in that. It's something we're still interested in exploring. We did explore it to some extent in our discussions with the department. Did not find that there was any, we're not informed and don't have reason to believe that there was any kind of intentional guidance given to target the media. But we're waiting, for the fruits of for those investigations to be completed. And I imagine that may be something that we'll revisit and take another look at once we have those investigations done.
Yeah, I would like to hear from both you and the department.
Yeah, everybody remember she's running for mayor
regarding media
in 2023.
Because I think that's critical. Thank you. The second, I'll just make a comment before my second question, which is that one of the most troubling things I found in the report, and that I observed, was the lack of dispersal orders. And your report mentioned,
Did you mention that in your negotiations with DPD? They thanked you so kindly
about the city's response to the protests, and that that lawsuit was settled, but there were changes in policy made, and some of the policies you cited about dispersal orders came from that. This is not the first time the city has been warned about two things: giving a dispersal order, and two, making it possible for people to comply. You cannot surround people, tell them to disperse, and then use force against them because there's nowhere for them to go.
Right.
And so I guess the question I wanted to ask you is related both to the question of dispersal orders and in some cases to the deployment of the pepper balls or less lethal aid, which is when we get asked questions about accountability, who really is accountable when you have a line of 30 officers? And you have a supervisor you describe most often as a sergeant who's there. You have a command center. I guess I want to ask you, in the audio and video you witnessed, how often is an order to begin using flash bombs, or to begin using, the canisters of chemical canisters? How often are those orders being given by a sergeant? How often are they being given by a command center versus the officer on the front line? And I believe that individual officers, we saw a video of an officer shooting a pepper ball at someone who was filming them with, no provocation shown in the video. Like, that officer is, as an individual, accountable for that action. But when you have a line of 30 officers, I guess I want to ask what you observed, and this is probably a longer conversation.
Question. What is your question?
What does policy say about accountability in cases like that? So I deployed a pepper ball in a situation that didn't meet policy, but I was directed to do so
by a supervisor. So help me understand what you learned and what you observed about that type of accountability.
That there is
Yeah,
none.
my best. I mean, it's a complicated, thoughtful question. Generally speaking, the decision to deploy gas grenades, so the decision to clear a particular location with gas, it's my understanding that that was generally a sort of a higher level decision, either from the command post or from the lieutenant who was responsible for a particular section. Because as I talked about in the report, the protest was sort of divided into 3 operational sections by the police department with a lieutenant in command of each. So the decision to deploy gas was generally a higher level decision. The decision to deploy individual kind of rounds from a launcher, either pepper ball or 40 millimeter rounds, may have been a combination of both individual officer discretion as well as guidance from whoever their sergeant was on the ground, kind of leading those officers. It is, a fact that every officer is kind of responsible for every round that they deploy. There are no kind of freebies. So every officer should be held accountable for every round that they deploy. In many cases, they may have been acting, with guidance from their sergeant. We certainly did hear video or see video and hear audio that reflected sergeants giving kind of the order, giving the command to begin deploying pepper ball. So I guess it's, but we also saw other situations in which officers appeared to be kind of acting on their own in deploying those munitions based on something that they observed in the crowd. So I think it's a little bit of a combination of both. As I mentioned, every officer in the DPD has a duty to intervene for the use of inappropriate force. So if an officer or a sergeant sees an officer using force inappropriately, that individual has an obligation under policy to intervene to prevent that use of inappropriate force. That may have been a long-winded or a kind of a confused mishmash of an answer, but I think it's because the policy framework is kind of complicated.
Yeah, I understand. Let me just ask one quick follow-up before I defer to the next colleague, which is, so in a situation where no dispersal order was given, and then a supervisor directs you to clear an area and disperse the crowd where no order is given, is our disciplinary policy clear enough and resilient enough to hold the supervisor accountable for violating the dispersal order policy? So will we, and like in the cases that you're aware of that are open, right, where the use of force violates the dispersal order provisions of our policy, will we be able to hold higher level supervisors accountable in those cases? And or I just want to understand how accountability will work, or if it will.
I mean, I think the policy is clear enough on that point, or at least the policy can be interpreted that way. I think the question is about maybe practice and what actually happens in practice. It's certainly something that we'll be looking at as we review those investigations. To the extent an officer says, I was directed to do X, it is a kind of a clearer case. If an officer kind of does X without that specific command from the sergeant, it may be a little bit of a more challenging case to make, but that is something that we will be looking at as we review those investigations.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councilman Flynn, you're up.
Thanks, Your Chair. Nick, thank you. I just have a couple quick questions and I have to jump onto a noon meeting, so I'll try to keep it brief, but this might be a little bit outside your scope, but it is involved in all through your report, and that's the issue of the curfew. But I'm wondering if you developed an opinion as to whether the imposition of a curfew contributed to worsening the situation, in that it created a dilemma for police when the curfew went into effect.
Same.
The protest was peaceful and occurring without violence. Did they have to disperse a peaceful protest simply because the clock struck 9? I know that later, outside those 5 days on which you focused, that sort of discretion came into play after that. But I'm wondering if you were able to develop an opinion on the effectiveness of the curfew.
So, I would say that I was able to develop an opinion on the less opportunities for conflict, the less conflict there was.
What?
So, as we saw sort of change tactics in later kind of protest days, we saw the police department giving more room to protesters. We saw greater distances between skirmish lines of officers and crowds of protesters, and the greater distance, what I think was an important contributor to, the reduced violence. Certainly not the only contributor, but it was a contributor to the extent that the curfew created opportunities for conflict. Conflict ensued. Was the curfew a bad idea? Well, I don't know. I think I was pretty careful in the report to make assertions that I could prove with the evidence. I haven't done a deep dive into curfew around the country. I don't have a real base of evidence to evaluate that. And nor do I know what would have happened without a curfew on the streets of Denver. So I'm not sure. I think it's a good question. It's a provocative question. It's something I'm interested in, but I don't know the answer.
Okay, well then just to follow up on that, and Councilwoman Sawyer got into this a little bit, but when violence starts to occur in the midst of a peaceful protest, a lot of what you concentrated on seems process-oriented, training, filling out reports, making sure the cameras are on, et cetera. But so from a process standpoint, I get it. From a tactical standpoint, did you have any opinions that you could express as to how, other than not using the rubber ball grenades that are indiscriminate, when violence occurs in the midst of a peaceful protest, which is what we saw with arson and at the McNichols building, for example, and the gunfire that occurred, I think, on the first day from somewhere within the crowd, any different tactics that could be suggested the police use, or is that outside your scope?
Different tactics in terms of responding to specific acts of violence?
Correct. In the midst of a peaceful protest, when bottles and rocks are thrown at police officers, for example, but it comes from within a crowd of peaceful protest, how is there any discovery you've made either in looking at other cities and how they handled it, or from your own experience that you could suggest, or is that beyond your scope as monitor?
I'm not sure if it's beyond my scope. It's not again, I'm not a tactics expert, and so I want to be sort of mindful of what my expertise is and what it isn't. Certainly, the police department, is careful and concerned about going into a crowd of peaceful protesters to try to arrest an individual who, has used a weapon or thrown a weapon at a police officer. And I think they're legitimately concerned about doing that because that has the tendency to inflame a crowd and create all kinds of other, potentially unforeseen issues and violence. So I think they're right to be careful about where and how they make arrests under those circumstances. It seemed to me, again, just to reiterate, the more sort of distance that there was between police officers and demonstrators, the less opportunity there was for those select individuals who were intending to do harm and violence. And so I think that was an important insight that the department developed as the protest went on, developed on its own, that change in tactics would be helpful. But how to specifically respond to the the hypothetical that you posed, I don't know that there's a clear answer, and if there is, I don't know what it is.
And we can discuss that with Director Robinson and Chief Basin going forward too. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I have to leave the meeting for another at noon. But thank you, Nick.
And thank you, Councilman. And we have invited Chief Basin to address committee, and that looks like it'll either be late this month or it could be in early January.
He's on vacation, y'all.
Let's see, next up, I've got Councilwoman
Isn't that nice?
Sudabaka and then Councilwoman Sandoval.
Sudabaka!
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll start off by adding a word to the word soup that Councilwoman Kanich added to validating. This report was validating for many of the people out there who testified and let us know that all of this was happening. So thank you for your diligence here. I want to follow up on a couple of points or questions already touched on. Councilwoman Sawyer talked a little bit about the evidence.com access and believing that you should have that access. I'm curious as to why you don't have that access when it seems like it would be a central or focal pool of your job.
Yeah, I appreciate the comment, Councilwoman, and the question. You know, it's a discussion I've had with the department before. Again, I'm not sure that Chief Payson and I have talked about it at length, and so I'll let the, I guess, police department represent or state what its concerns are or why it hasn't given that access. I think the provision that was adopted by the council back in, I don't know, 2015, maybe giving us broad access to evidence inside the police and sheriff departments is broad enough that it encompasses the databases of the department. So I think as a sort of legal matter, I think we're probably entitled to have it. We don't as yet, and I think it's probably time for that to change.
I'm curious about if there is a section of recommendations being developed that is not specific to the crowd control policies, but more about policy changes related to the interaction or processes with DPD and the monitor. It feels like perhaps a recommendation should have been made regarding access of body cam footage. And I'm wondering if it was just not the report for that, or if that's a separate thing that's that's coming to us.
Yeah, I it's not something I'm currently working on. I know and I can't speak for the Citizen Oversight Board, but it some of its members have expressed concern about that issue regarding evidence.com and maybe other issues as well. So that may be inappropriate since that board oversees the sort of system and including my office and makes policy recommendations concerning these kinds of issues. That might be an appropriate sort of question or topic for discussion with that board.
Got it. And I'm curious about all of the arrests that were made. The 38 links for body cam footage out of the hundreds of officers present, hundreds of arrests made, is blowing my mind. So did you try to attach body cam footage to all of the arrests made?
I don't think we did, because I'm not even it would have been extremely difficult to try to do that. I think in the context of the criminal cases that are pending, the department will be under a duty to provide discovery to each of those defendants, which would include body cam video that can be specifically linked to those arrests. It seemed to me that many of those arrests were not recorded. And so for the ones that were recorded, we did not try to link the footage to those arrests.
I also didn't see anything in the report specifically about people's challenges obtaining body cam footage. We know a lot of people have requested body cam footage with names of individual police who were involved in their arrests, and they have been unable to obtain that footage. Did you have any other complaints or issues around that topic?
I think we've been made aware of that issue. We've heard of that issue. We've seen press reports about that issue. We didn't focus on it because it was sort of an issue that may have occurred after the protest. It wasn't sort of an ongoing operational problem related to the actual use of force and management of the events themselves. But we have heard about that, and we are aware that people have made complaints or raised concerns about the transparency of the body camera footage and a lack of ability to get it so far.
I didn't see a recommendation around obtaining body cam footage or transparency with body cam footage. Would you have a recommendation on body cam footage and transparency and access there for the public and victim?
Yeah. No, that was something I addressed in the report I issued about the death of Michael Marshall in the jails in Denver a couple of years ago, and included a recommendation at that time for the need for the Department of Safety to develop and make available to the public a kind of clear and explicit document that articulates the process for obtaining evidence, the timelines associated with obtaining that evidence, and the considerations that the department would weigh when determining whether or not to make that evidence available. So I guess I would probably refer back to that recommendation that we made several years ago in that report.
Awesome. And going back to the rosters that were never created, I'm having trouble wrapping my head around DPD not knowing where hundreds of officers were at any given moment. And so I'm wondering, besides the rosters that would be used for protests like this, are there not any other tools like the GPS tracking of vehicles or shift data that would have helped us figure out where officers were during these protests?
You know, I think some of the payroll data might be able to reveal kind of an overall count, but it wouldn't really tell us the other information that we would expect to find in a roster, like the certifications that were held by the officer, or perhaps even the assignments, the geographic assignments, or who they were reporting to, or what they were assigned to do. So given our desire to get this report done and to you as quickly as possible, we didn't really spend what we thought would be an awfully long time combing through all of the payroll records for the department, because we didn't feel that they would reveal all of that much to us. It was clear enough that the department needed rosters and didn't have them. The payroll records might tell us the overall kind of numbers of who was working there, but wouldn't help with accountability all that much because they wouldn't really tell us where people were working.
So that leads to my next question. The monitor in the charter is tasked not only with the policy recommendations, but possible disciplinary recommendations. And so I'm wondering what the accountability recommendations are in here. I see a lot of recommendations on how we make it better for next time, but what is your office recommending to hold people accountable for all of the policies that were not complied with this time around?
You know, I think in the first instance, we're overseeing all of the investigations into the allegations of misconduct, and we're going to work as hard as we can, given the authority that we have, which is not command authority. We can't tell the department what to do. We can make recommendations and report back to the public. So we're going to work hard to make sure that those investigations are thorough and complete, and where violations occur in those individual kind of incidents, that there's accountability for that. In terms of the broader issues, the kind of lack of compliance with policies that we sketch out in the report by the department in general, I'm not sure that I have a great answer to that. I'm certainly interested in your thoughts as an oversight body of a different kind. I'm not sure that I have a perfect answer for that one, but I'm certainly interested in being in a dialogue and discussion with you all about what you think is appropriate.
What percentage of the cases that you investigated are going through the DPD internal affairs process for further investigation?
So right now, given the current state of the law, which does not allow the OIM to do the misconduct investigations, we must, by law, refer those to the police department for its own internal affairs review. 100% of the misconduct investigations are being handled by the Police Internal Affairs Bureau.
Would changing that be a recommendation that your office would make?
Excuse me, Councilman.
Don't shut her up.
After this answer, move on to Councilwoman Sandoval. We'll come back to you if the monitor can hang with us. Go ahead, Nick.
I'm certainly kind of willing to have conversation about that, and I'm not sure that we would make that recommendation at this point, but it's certainly something that is worth discussing, and there are probably things to recommend it, and things we could talk about as potential issues that would have to be addressed. So yeah, I'm willing to talk about it. I'm not sure that we're at a point where we're going to make that recommendation right now.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you. And as I said, I'll get back to you in a few minutes. Councilman Sandoval.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Nick, for this report. I'll admit, I have not gotten through the whole entire thing, but I plan to. I want to take as much time reading it and thoroughly as much time as you spent providing it to us for City Council.
Reading's hard. Every single meeting, they complain about reading being hard. Every single one.
In your presentation early on about lawsuits coming through the city, are those lawsuits from individuals, from protesters against the officers, or is it also you in the same vein you mentioned about property damage from the small businesses and other? Are any of them property damage lawsuits, or are they all just the protesters against the individual officers? Can you just explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, and so I've seen the notices of claim. I looked at them in connection with this project. I have not reviewed them in detail, so probably the city attorney's office could do a better job of parsing all that out. But my understanding is that most of the lawsuits and notices of claim are either have been filed by individuals, or I think one of them is fashioned as a class action lawsuit. And I think they're not so much against individual officers, but they're against the city and the police department in connection with what happened at the protest. So in many of the lawsuits, it's my understanding they're not naming individual officers because they don't know who is responsible for the conduct that they're complaining about. Just like in the internal affairs process, we're having an awfully hard time figuring out who is responsible for the conduct complained about. So they're against the city and the police department. I think I saw one claim from a business owner or maybe an insurer for a business related to property damage sustained by that business during the protest. I frankly didn't spend a lot of time looking at that or looking at the claim because it was a little bit outside of my scope. There may be others that they're going to be filed related to property damage, but I'm not too sure about that.
And then for some of the recommendations that the police department responded to yesterday that we were sent, I was just hoping that maybe we can circle back around. I know we had this discussion in June, and I know that you and your office worked as diligently as possible to get us this report in a timely fashion. But sometimes in committee, it's hard to discuss all of the finer points because we have to stay at such a high level. So I would just ask if we could possibly, Mr. Chair, think about coming back around. Some of the recommendations from the police department say that they would be finished I'm sure you got this, Nick, as well, at the end of January. So maybe in February, we can talk about how they're being implemented and what that process looks like so that we can all stay on the same page, because I think this is such an important issue for all of us in the city and county of Denver that I would hate for this to be the one time that you can come to us and not have a conversation about what you think the response from the Denver Police Department was. And with that, thank you all for your time, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Councilwoman. And yes, indeed, as I said, we'll be hearing from Chief Payson in the next few weeks And then this is the beginning of an important and continuing discussion. So I would hope to have him back a number of times to talk about the progress. Excuse me, Mr. Monitor, did you have a response to the councilwoman specifically?
Only that, I'd be more than happy to provide, any information or come back anytime that, the committee needs me to be here.
Thank you, sir. Councilwoman Sotobaca, did you want to continue for a few minutes? Mr. Monitor, are you okay for a little bit?
I'm good.
Just one last question. Was there any involvement of the sheriff's office or recommendations that will be separate for the sheriff's office?
The sheriff's office did respond, and my understanding is that did not, was not involved in making arrests. They were transporting individuals. They were running the scout van. They did some work, protecting the jails and some other municipal buildings. So we didn't really focus, given how much was on our plate with the police department. We obtained some documents from the sheriff's department to get a sense of their involvement, but didn't really spend any time, interviewing sheriff personnel or doing additional legwork associated with the sheriff's department. Again, because they, from our understanding, they weren't really involved in making arrests, didn't use a significant amount of force. But if you have reason to believe otherwise, we're happy to take a look at that. But that's not something we focused on at this point.
Good to know. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. And I'll just close, Mr. Mitchell, with thanking you again. And while you are the face of the monitor's office, I'm well aware of the large team you have behind you that did a whole lot of heavy lifting in getting this report out. It's just an impressive bit of work that's going to lay the foundation for an important continuing discussion. And we appreciate your willingness to be an ongoing part of that work. So with that being said, I want to thank my colleagues for their questions and their participation, their willingness to hang with us, going a little bit over time. With that said, we have no action items today. So this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm putting up my last tweet and to get you up to speed. So what happened there at the end that was so important? I've said this a lot, and you've probably heard a lot. We're not going to say it less. We are hamstrung by a city charter that needs to change. We're going to be talking about that all next year. So, I mean, if you're protesting, I get it. I understand wanting to break stuff. I want to break stuff right now, but we cannot lose sight of what needs to happen. Nothing is going to change if we don't change our city charter, because we're spending money on an investigation. You heard him say himself that refers directly back to the DPD for internal investigation, not to the justice system, and not to the DA for prosecution. We still can't name, and they don't have to name officers because they claim not to know who was where doing what. So it's a black box, and nothing can seal the black box by law. It is a law. We got to change the law. I know policy is boring. I know city council meetings are boring. I know everything is boring. I get it. You think I like this shit? I would really want to stand with my kids. I would like to be working today. I would like to go back to my life and not knowing anything about this process, but I can't. And I can't pretend it's not happening. So I'm begging you, back Candy up on this. We've got to care about changing the city charter. And if we really are going to be serious about defunding DPD, because defund is policy. All right. Yay! Breaking things is how we make sure that city council is listening. But if we're not telling them exactly what to do and getting mad at them every single time they open their fucking mouths, then we're not being effective. I'm begging you. There's a lane for everyone in the revolution. take a minute to get in mind and yell at city council, and then get ready to do the boring work all next year of getting people to sign petitions and change the city charter. Thank you. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck in this loop for a really long time, and I want out. I don't know about you, but I want out.